old. And if I ask Tony, do you feel like you're a boy or girl or neither? Tony goes, oh, I'm a boy. Okay, great. That's his gender identity. And then if I were to examine Tony, Tony has testicles, a penis, typically male characteristics. If we, were to go and test Tony's DNA, it would come back as XY. And so we can say, okay, Tony's biologically male. And then Tony is playing with girls' skirts and trying them on and dressing up. So that's totally normal. That's gender variance. But that comes under gender expression. So, that's how people are portraying themselves. So it's a variance gender expression. And then we're not going to talk about orientation because Tony's 4 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll come way later on.
Yeah.
And so gender variance is completely normal, but gender dysphoria is the clinical issue which needs treating. And gender dysphoria arrives from, and the word dysphoria comes from dys, meaning bad or problem. It is the intense stress and distress that comes from when your body does not match your identity. And so someone who is transgender typically experiences gender dysphoria because it's incredibly stressful to be a woman stuck in the body of a man, for example. And so that's what we are looking to help. And that gender dysphoria produces a whole lot of sort of domino effects in terms of ill mental health. And also when someone starts to change the way that they express their gender, that attracts a lot of abuse from society still, which is not helpful to mental health. And so there is a comorbidity of mental illness that occurs with gender dysphoria because it is intense stress and intensely distressing. And what we now know is that gender variance is expected in most children, frankly, but gender dysphoria is not something that we expect. We don't expect a 6-year-old to be in tears on a regular basis because they feel that they are a boy, let's say, but they have the body of a girl. That's not normal. Now, what's not normal there is that they are so distressed because kids should not be that distressed. What they need is support. What is interesting is that we know that if someone has a gender identity which is not congruent with their physical sex characteristics, if that is still the case at Tanner stage 2 of puberty, then that's it for life generally. And by that, what I mean is that people often say, oh, well, children are changing constantly and we can't know, and who knows, they'll change their mind when they're older. What we do know is that once you hit Tanner stage 2 of puberty, you don't tend to change your mind. That tends to be it for life.
How old is that? So what are the stages of puberty, just quickly, so that
the Tanner stages, there's basically like a few core stages. And when we talk about Tanner stage 2 of puberty, we're essentially talking about breast budding, testicular enlargement, perhaps the first signs of hair in the armpits and around the groin. It's the first physical, like observable signs of puberty that one sees that happens after the growth spurts. So there's no age that is specifically associated with.
So it's just the stage of where they're at and what's happening to their bodies at that time.
It's the early changes.
So when that starts to happen, and they're changing into the mature version of the sex that they are, that's when that dysphoria starts.
It's not necessarily that. That's when the distress and dysphoria tends to get worse because you're starting to go through a puberty that you really don't want to go through. But the dysphoria can start at any age. We know that some kids at a very young age know that they are trans. And some people only know later in adulthood. But what we do know is that at that point, that's when the brain starts to change. And
Yeah.
certainly if you had Tony who is playing with girls' toys, we would generally expect that, you know, at that point, if Tony's saying, no, I'm a girl, that if that's still the case at Tanner stage 2 of puberty, that's Tony is actually has a female gender identity at that point, and that's going to be the case for life.
Yeah.
Um, it's not a phase or a stage.
Mm.
And so gender dysphoria is clinically important because it requires medical assistance and
Mm.
social assistance.
Yeah.
And so if we
Yeah.
talk, if we go back a step and we talk about LGBTQIA, we've got lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexuality.
Mm.
There's a few terms here which people might be more or less comfortable with. Queer used to be a sort of insulting term, but young people these days have co-opted it. It's now an
Mm.
umbrella term. So everything under this umbrella of LGBTQIA plus can also be referred to as queer, as a sort of
Mm.
rainbow community. We've talked
I've
about
noticed that a lot of
intersex.
people call
Yeah.
themselves queer now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a nice way of rejecting needing to put things in
Mm.
buckets and in boxes, because a lot of things tend to fall down when, you know, particular sexual orientation sort of falls down when you are non-binary, because
Mm.
it's probably an outdated social construct for many
Yeah.
people. But one acknowledges that one's queer. And it's a nice umbrella term that is
Mm.
non-specific. It's not putting things in a box, but it's acknowledging that a person has an LGBTQIA identity and is a member of that community. And then the last thing here is asexuality. So A in the Greek and Latin means not, and sexuality, sexual. So depending on how you look at it, you can either break it down into aromantic and asexual, or you can conceive of asexuality as a whole as someone who doesn't experience sort of sexual attraction and doesn't want to engage in sex, as it were.
Mm.
Um, and and so essentially, if someone is asexual, that means that they don't have sexual attraction and wish to engage in sex.
Mm.
For some people, that also includes being aromantic, in which case they don't want to be in a romantic relationship with another partner. But that is not always the case for asexual people.
Mm.
It just means that they don't have the desire for sex. And
Mm.
there's nothing wrong with that, again, because if we
Yeah.
understand that nature is a spectrum, and not only is it a spectrum, but it's actually a bell curve, the
Mm.
majority of people have this much libido and sort of sexual attraction and want this much sexual activity. And then you have people on the fringes. You've got people who want
Mm.
a lot more sex than the average person, and you've got people who experience a lot less sexual drive,
Mm.
and sexual attraction than the average person, because things
Mm.
bell curve out in nature.
There was a group. I was watching Mardi Gras parade the other week, and there was a group that had a they were in the parade, and they were a group uh, of from the asexual organization. I can't remember, and they were talking particularly about their group and their organization because for a very long time they had no recognition and no, even though they were part of the Mardi Gras organization, they just received no acknowledgement and no recognition of
Yeah.
being part of the organization. And it was actually a little bit sad. I felt sorry
Mm.
for I felt sorry for them, because they're part of the organization too, and everybody deserves to be included, and I think this
Yeah.
is the most important part, and something that we really promote is inclusion when it comes to this, and just because their aspect is different to everyone else's, they should feel just as included as everybody else too.
Totally. And asexuality is highly stigmatized because our
Mm.
society is so focused on sex, because
Yeah.
it's how we sell and market to people. It's what we expect people to engage in. It's what so much
Mm.
of our teen and adult, um, you know, movies and
Yeah.
cinema and everything is geared towards. Um,
Mm.
because it's a very powerful evolutionary motivator to help a species
Yeah.
survive.
Yeah.
But you don't need everyone to have sex. You just need enough people to have sex that the species survives. And there's
Yeah,
probably,
exactly.
yeah. And so,
And if
I mean, we won't,
anything, we're overpopulated as it is.
honestly, and so,
Yeah.
there's,
And there's all
we
different
won't,
kinds of love when we're talking about that in particular. There's all different kinds of love. And, when we're talking about achievement and we're talking about, success and, there's a lot of aspects to life that you can receive fulfillment from. It doesn't
100%.
necessarily mean that there's only one part of life that's the most important, just to kind of
Exactly.
put context into everything, really.
Exactly. And we won't
Mm.
dive too deep into the sort of evolutionary
Yeah.
biology, but there is probably an adaptive advantage to having queer people as part of the human race in our evolutionary
Mm.
biology, in the same way that we know that it's advantageous to us that we have neurodivergent people as part of the human race
Mm.
in our evolutionary biology. I mean, we look back at most of the great inventors throughout time, a lot of them were clearly neurodivergent. Um, so from an evolutionary biology perspective, there is probably an advantage to having queer people in our species, whether that is asexuality or same-sex attraction.
Mm.
Um, yeah, we'll leave it there because that's a whole
Oh,
multi-hours
no, I think we're
of
going a bit.
discussion.
Yeah.
Um, but if we come back to sort of diverse gender and sexuality and how that interacts with medicine. And when we talk about it from a medical context, and we start talking about emergency medicine and pre-hospital care and paramedicine, there's something called the Dutch model, which I want to talk about. So this is a famous model, and he happens to be trans, and people would probably never know. And the reason for that is because he has had such successful medical affirming care. And that started early on in puberty. And the Dutch model is also called the 12, 16, 18 model. And these numbers are